Hey, what's going on, you guys? My name is the Raptor, and lo and behold, you've given me even more matchups to review. When, oh when does it ever end? No, but really, this has been a super fun series to continue, and I thank everyone who's been keeping track of my community posts and participating. If anyone here is new and wants to know how to do that, just read the description. We've got an interesting collection today, so without further ado, let's take a look. First up on the list, All Might vs. Captain Falcon, My Hero Academia vs. F-Zero. Some people will remember this matchup as one of those what could have been episodes of Death Battle. It was very highly considered for around the season 6 time, but obviously that ended up not working out, and we got two different episodes in that season, Johnny vs. Captain Falcon and All Might vs. Guy. I actually made a whole video talking about instances like that if you want to go check that out. Now personally, I'm quite a big fan of both of those episodes, particularly the latter, so I'm very happy with the two episodes that we got instead, but I'd still be curious to see what this episode could have turned out like, because I do think it is a very cool idea. Fights with the theme of legacy are always pretty interesting to me, as long as they work well enough in other areas, and this is a little different because this is the legacy of not just the heroes, but what it means to be number one, and I think that brings great potential for analysis writing. There's definitely not too many moving parts in terms of what these characters can do, you know, their general versatility. The debate side of things would probably be pretty straightforward, but that's still fine as long as Death Battle can make this different enough from other previous episodes, which I think they could. It has a really good personality backing it up. They could really play up the spectacle of their heaviest attacks and really lean into the aforementioned themes. Like, I think they could really make this work if they use the right elements. Now, in terms of the likelihood of this episode actually happening, it's hard to say because it ultimately didn't happen because Death Battle thought it was too one-sided, but they said the same thing about Phoenix versus Raven before, and that eventually happened, and the demand for it hasn't stopped either, so I think it does have a chance if they want to bring either of these characters back, or bring My Hero Academia back, or something like that. You know, I think it could work out. Up next, Phineas and Ferb versus George and Harold, Disney versus Captain Underpants. Now, I gotta be completely honest, I wasn't too sure about this idea when I first heard it, and this is coming from a guy that really respects both of these series, and has consumed nearly all of the mainstream content from each of them. However, I have kind of warmed up to it as time has passed, because both series are a lot of fun and have lots of crazy content, and just seeing all of that content play off of each other, I think is a big enough draw for a lot of people to see this episode, and I can respect that. For me personally, the biggest draw for this episode happening would be the presentation. These characters are creativity incarnate, in their own special ways. There are so many neat elements that could be worked into the animation and the analyses. Just making this a love letter to the Phineas and Ferb and Captain Underpants series, I think would be an amazing production. But if there's one more thing I can say about this matchup, oh my god, it's that this is one of those matchups that desperately needs preset rules and or conditions. And not just in the sense of what technology do Phineas and Ferb get access to, but also stuff like, do George and Harold get Captain Underpants? And if so, would Phineas and Ferb get Perry, even though that doesn't make nearly as much logical sense? And if Captain Underpants is the one doing most, if not all of the work on George and Harold's side, then shouldn't he just get his own episode? Because at that point it feels like you're trying to force George and Harold and Phineas and Ferb to get their own episode, and you miss out on some pretty cool Captain Underpants matchups. Plus, in the Phineas and Ferb world, I do think they have better matchups or better opportunities for matchups, like Perry versus Skipper or a Dr. Doofenshmirtz matchup, whichever one you want to land on. So essentially, these four characters are not the characters from either series I would see Death Battle defaulting to, but I also know better than to rule anything out. I'm just saying it would surprise me and there would be some challenges to overcome in order to make it work, but if you like it, hey, that's amazing. Moving on, Shrek versus Conker, DreamWorks versus Rare. This matchup had a real spotlight of popularity on it thanks to the Death Battle cast episode that came out. I have to imagine that's how it got enough upvotes to be on this series in the first place, and it wasn't really on my radar for Shrek before, but I have to admit I can see some flaws in his more prominent matchups. Like, I liked the idea of Shrek versus Sully before, but in hindsight that was mostly due to bias-based appeals and stuff like that, you know, as opposed to anything more concrete, whereas this matchup, in contrast, emphasizes similarities in the types of worlds that these guys come from and how they fit into their worlds. And I can respect matchups like that a lot. Like, for instance, way back when, I really liked the idea of Puss in Boots from Shrek versus Inigo Montoya from The Princess Bride. ride, because they come from very similar worlds and the point of those movies are very similar as well. That was my preferred matchup for Puss in Boots until The Last Wish came out, and I kind of just felt like it was unnecessary at that point, but that's just me. So that should go to show that there should be more appeals to a matchup than just that basis, but that's exactly what it is, a good basis. I don't know if I would say this is the best Shrek matchup ever created, but I do believe it is at least among the better ones overall. There's enough story and capabilities information to go over for both of them, to keep you engaged, to keep things interesting, and it's hard to say if it's actually debatable, but there are some moving parts, some specific questions to answer, so I think that works well with its other appeals. Now, getting a well-supported death battle cast definitely increases a matchup's chances for happening on the show, although I could see them going with a more popular Shrek option instead of this one, because, they still gotta make money, but they do seem to like this matchup well enough, so personally, I wouldn't be too surprised if we got it sometime later. After that, lose Noceda versus Boonchuy, the Owl House versus Amphibia. Yeah, this is a big one. This is probably the biggest cartoon fight involving more recent characters that people are talking about, and I know it's not loved by everyone. Some people prefer different opponents for them, or some people just don't like the comparison in the first place, but the way I see it, this matchup has all of the base appeals to be popular with the proper demographic, the people who really watch and enjoy these shows. And while I can't say that I find myself in that demographic, I do feel like I can appreciate this matchup for what it does really well. I have always said that relatability is a really good angle for matchmaking, and getting invested in the main characters is really important for a death battle like this. And I think that these characters being such three-dimensional characters with lots of story moments, twists and turns, character development, all of that stuff, I think there's more than enough information and more than enough content to make really full and well-written analyses out of, as long as Death Battle understands the points of the series well enough, that is. But ultimately, I don't really have that many specific things to say about this matchup, good or bad. Whether or not you like it, it doesn't seem to me like it has anything that would break itself or not allow it to work. It seems fun, and there's more than enough combative elements on each side to work. It's basically a perfect cartoon matchup for Death Battle, like Steven Universe versus Star Butterfly. Not saying that that was the perfect episode or anything like that, but the characters fit the Death Battle formula very, very well. And I'm willing to say that this matchup will happen. It is basically next to confirmed. We know Death Battle wants to do it sooner rather than later. Personally, for a while, I thought it could have been the final episode of this year, the one after Bowser vs. Eggman, but now I'm not so sure. I think it's a little more up in the air. I'm still thinking, though, sometime next year, if not this year. I would be very surprised if they pushed it all the way back to 2026 or later. Next up, Emmet vs. Jesse, the Lego Movie versus Minecraft Story Mode. As I've said in earlier episodes of this series, I am not that familiar with Minecraft. I've already been crucified, so you can calm down. However, I am quite familiar with Lego and the Lego Movie series, although personally I found the second part to be quite underwhelming, but that's besides the point. These are not really the first characters from either of these franchises that my mind jumps to for verses, but I do think they bring a lot to the table, both individually and as a matchup together. What essentially this matchup boils down to is, they're the major main characters of the story versions of these very popular brands. So it is kind of standard and simple, but in my opinion, in a good way. I think it's a very cool comparison of their capability mechanics, because there is some overlap of what they can do, but the way that their abilities operate are still quite different. And I think making that comparison would be rather interesting to watch, even if there turns out to not be a super huge debate that comes with this matchup. Naturally, this is one of those limitless creativity ideas like Sackboy versus Maxwell and Mickey Mouse versus Bugs Bunny. Personally, it's not the most interesting one to me, just because there are so many matchups with that quality and so many of those matchups that I want to see more than this one, but this one still has a lot of fan service, a lot of nostalgia fuel, and that has worked on me for looking forward to other matchups. So I totally get it that there's a big following for this one, that a lot of people really want to see it, and I think if they nail those aspects, it could be a lot of fun for those people. I have seen more vocal support for this one than Steve versus Emmet, but something is telling me they might just do that one instead, just because they are the most popular icons from their franchises, and it was on the champion poll, so naturally there are some people that want to see that one, but I could see them going with either one. I think both have their own advantages, so I wouldn't be too disappointed either way. Moving on, The Mask versus Beetlejuice, Dark Horse versus Warner Brothers. Beetlejuice matchups have certainly gotten some more discussion time since Beetlejuice came out, not to mention the Death Battle cast episode of this very matchup. But yeah, there's Grimm from the Grim Adventures of Billy and Mandy, there's the Ghostbusters, which I find quite interesting, and there are more, but the mask has been his longest standing request, and I think pretty much still is, so it's no surprise to me that this one is still getting the most amount of buzz. This matchup is built perfectly for the absurd side of Death Battle, you know, trying to apply any sort of logic to their feats, talking about their biggest and greatest feats. There's lots of room for funny writing and sweet banter between the characters. I think production-wise and presentation-wise, this could be a real spectacle that anyone could enjoy. I do think this is a cool combo of cartoons that more or less exist among real people, and unfortunately that could be pretty difficult to represent in the fight itself, because it essentially just becomes two cartoon-like characters fighting each other. Maybe if they include human civilians in the animation, they could play with that a little more. I could see that working. But either way, I still think the fight could be well done, and it could still implement references from each of the series. So I'm not saying it couldn't be unique. I still think it definitely could be. I just think if they want to use the characters to their fullest and what they're really known for, they might have to get a little creative. But they're gonna have to get creative anyway, so I think it could definitely work. And if they wanted to pull an Omni-Man versus Bardock here and give the mask a more serious fight, then yeah, I could see them doing this, although he still has other options. Like, I still think Freakazoid versus the Mask is a perfectly fine matchup, but no matter what they go with for him, it would definitely be a big undertaking, but that means they could make something really, really good out of it. After that, Garfield versus Snoopy, Paws Inc. versus Peanuts. Now, before I start talking about this matchup as an actual matchup, I just want to say that I absolutely love both of these characters, and they are very near and dear to me. I grew up loving Garfield, and I loved his appreciation for lasagna, and hatred for Mondays, and all that good stuff, and in 10th grade, I actually got to play Charlie Brown in our high school's production of You're a Good Man, Charlie Brown, so I grew a huge appreciation for Snoopy from that point forward. And I didn't really grow up thinking that these characters were that similar to each other, but I have to admit it is a baseline appropriate comic strip pair. Now, there is a big part of me that doesn't feel like this should be an actual fight, but it's hard for me to tell whether or not this is personal, because I feel like it could be something like Scooby versus Courage, where you're kind of questioning whether or not it should be a fight, but then it turns out to be really, really awesome. But for me, I just don't really want to see either of these characters die, and Death Battle can't just keep doing draws over and over, you know? So it might depend on if each of them have enough stuff that's combat related. I know Garfield has some insane stuff, so it could very well work. It just feels a little weird, you know? And while it could be fun in a Scooby versus Courage-like way if they have enough stuff going for them, I feel like this is also one of those matchups that could more easily fall flat, because let's be honest with ourselves, most of these characters' best attributes aren't combative. That's not the reason why we love these characters so much, and there are people that complain when stuff in Death Battle gets too different, so I'd be worried if you're trying to represent the characters as best as possible, would people not really like that as much because they'd have to change some things up? I'm just spitballing here, just really thinking out loud, but still, I do think that is something to keep in mind. And if I'm gonna be perfectly honest, I personally don't really see this episode happening. There are so many other matchups with more obvious prospects, even ones that are quote-unquote similar to this one. I just can't see this one being that high on the priority list. They'd have to really want to do it. So it would surprise me if it happens, but I guess I'd have something to look forward to if it did. But those are my basic thoughts. And finally, we have Tenya Iida versus A-Train, My Hero Academia versus The Boys. Out of all of the matchups that we have talked about in this video, I gotta say I'm the biggest fan of this one. And I know I am a little biased because I absolutely love speedsters. It's the reason why I grew up loving Sonic, Flash, Quicksilver, Dash, you know, all of those characters. And moving away from these super overpowered Flashes would be nice for Death Battle. And these characters just come from interesting takes on superhero worlds, which would enhance the differences if you really lean into those aspects. The connective tissue here is not just speed, and I think it's always great when story or arc-based overlap is found in really any kind of matchup, and it is an easy way to know how to write the episode and make it good. If you lean into those aspects as well as their capabilities, again, that just makes for full analyses. It's really as simple as that. I know this matchup could be seen as more boring to some people power-wise, and unfortunately I am inclined to somewhat agree, quality, especially when you compare it to other episodes with speedsters that Death Battle has already done and have done really well. I think this episode would absolutely need to have good choreography, good dialogue, and good overall analyses. And I'm not really saying that as a negative. I personally could get a lot out of it having those qualities. I just think there might be more of a risk here, but Death Battle has done really well with episodes that have characters that have powers less extravagant than these guys even, so I think it could work as long as it's done well enough. This is one of the major boys matchups aside from maybe Peacemaker versus Soldier Boy that people are talking about, so I could see this one happening at some point, especially since the shows will remain popular for a good while, so this would be a good candidate for it, and I'd be really happy to see what Death Battle makes out of it. I just love speedsters so much. And with that, our time today is up, but I hope you enjoyed what I had to say in this video. Again, information for how to contribute to this series will be down below, and feel free to give your thoughts on any of this video's matchups. Like, comment, subscribe if you want to see more from me. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one. Have a great day, and peace out.